Vasily's man had my wrist twisted hard enough to bruise, and the second cart waiting beyond the alley was close enough that I could smell the horse's fear alongside my own. "You should have simply come home quietly," he said, "and spared everyone this trouble." "I did not run 3 days in a wool barrel to be dragged home in a produce cart," I said, and drove my heel down onto his boot with everything I had left, and it was in the half-second his grip loosened that I heard, somewhere behind the alley wall, the particular sound of a king's wolf deciding it had heard quite enough. I did not know yet whether Declan would reach me before Vasily's man recovered his grip. I only knew I had already survived one escape from that man's plans for me, and I was not going quietly into a second. Let me tell you how I ended up in that alley, because it started 6 days earlier, curled inside a wool barrel in the back of a merchant's cart, praying the road would end anywhere but where it started. I was 23, and I had spent the 3 weeks before that barrel learning, in increasingly specific detail, exactly how a father settles a war debt when he has run out of coin and has one unmarried daughter left to offer instead. Lord Vasily had lent my father considerably more than my father could repay, over several bad harvests and one disastrous border skirmish. And the settlement my father negotiated, without troubling to ask my opinion of it, was simple enough. My hand, formalised at a claiming ceremony, in exchange for the debt's full forgiveness. I had met Vasily exactly twice. Both times he had looked at me the way a man looks at a ledger entry finally balancing, and both times I had gone to bed afterward with a very clear understanding that I intended to be somewhere else entirely by the time that ceremony arrived. My mother, when I told her what I intended, did not try to stop me, though I watched real fear cross her face at the thought of what might happen to either of us if my father discovered the plan before I was safely gone. She packed what little food she could spare without drawing notice and pressed my grandmother's silver brooch into my hand herself, telling me plainly that she would rather see me disappear into an uncertain future than watch me marry a man who looked at me the way Vasily did. I have not forgotten that kindness, and I do not intend to. I did not have money for a proper escape. I had instead a merchant named Corbin who passed through our village every 3rd week, hauling wool to sell along the northern road. A soft spot for my mother's cooking, and a willingness, for the price of my grandmother's last silver brooch, to let me ride hidden among his cargo as far as the border, no questions asked beyond the ones politeness required. I climbed into an empty wool barrel 3 mornings before the claiming was meant to occur, certain of exactly one thing, that wherever that cart ended up, it would not be Vasily's haul. I was correct about that much, at least. I did not know, curled in the dark with wool fibres working their way into every seam of my clothing, that Corbin's northern route that particular week included a delivery contract with the royal household of Aldrich. No, not Aldrich. I misremember myself even now recounting it, though I promise you the mistake mattered considerably less than what came after. The cart was bound, the whole time, for the palace of King Declan, and I had no idea of it at all until the wheels finally stopped and I heard voices considerably grander than any border crossing had any business producing. I heard the unloading begin before I understood what was happening, crates and barrels shifting around me, and I had just enough time to press myself as small and still as possible before I heard a sound that did not belong to any ordinary delivery at all. A low, urgent growl, considerably too large to belong to any dog, moving directly toward my barrel with a single-minded purpose that made my whole body go rigid with dread. "Your Grace," a voice said, alarmed, "the wolf will not settle." It has fixed on the wool shipment specifically. The lid came off my barrel a moment later, and I found myself blinking up into the face of a king I had never in my life expected to meet, his own composure visibly unravelling in real time as his wolf pressed forward past him, nose buried against my wool-tangled hair, refusing every attempt to call it back. "There is a woman in the wool," King Declan said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man narrating events he did not yet believe himself. I am aware, I said, extracting a strand of fibre from my mouth with as much dignity as the situation allowed. I would very much like to know the same thing about myself if anyone here has an explanation. He did not have one. That much was obvious from the sheer bewildered honesty on his face, a king staring at his own wolf's behaviour like a man trying to solve an equation someone had changed the rules of mid-calculation. I do not understand what is happening, he admitted, more to his own wolf than to me. It has never once done this before. That, Ferris said, arriving at a near run and taking in the scene with the particular weary patience of a man who had clearly managed a great deal of royal chaos in his time, may be the single greatest understatement I have heard you make in 4 years of service. Your Grace. By then, a small crowd of kitchen staff, stable hands, and one thoroughly bewildered wool merchant had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the king of the realm kneel beside an overturned barrel while his wolf refused to move an inch from a wool-covered stranger's side. Corbin, for his part, looked as though he might faint from the sheer improbability of the delivery he had just completed, muttering something about never in 40 years of hauling wool having produced this particular result. And I could not entirely blame him for the sentiment. I was helped down from the cart, wool still clinging to nearly every surface of me, and escorted, not to a dungeon, though I had genuinely braced for one, but to a modest guest chamber, while Declan's household attempted, with visible confusion, to determine what exactly they were meant to do with a stowaway his own wolf had apparently decided was not to be treated as one. Declan came to see me himself that same evening, still visibly rattled, and I understood, watching him hover uncertainly in the doorway of a room he technically owned, exactly how unprepared this particular king was for whatever his own instincts had just done to his afternoon. I am told I owe you an explanation, he said, though I confess I do not entirely have one to give. My wolf has never surfaced this strongly for anyone. I do not know what to make of finding it buried in a wool shipment. I would settle for an explanation of why I am not currently being marched back to Lord Vasily in chains, I said, if it is all the same to you. Something in his face sharpened at the name. Vasily. The border lord. The border lord I climbed into a barrel to avoid marrying, I said, and told him plainly exactly how a father settles a debt when he has run out of coin and one daughter left to spend instead. He listened without interrupting, something in his expression growing steadily more serious as the story went on, my father's mounting debts. The 2 stilted meetings with a man who never once asked my opinion of anything, the growing certainty in the weeks before the claiming that I would rather vanish entirely than sign myself over to a stranger who spoke of me the way other men spoke of livestock. When I finished, he was quiet a long moment. You are not going anywhere you do not choose to go, he said finally. Not back to him, not anywhere at all, until you have decided for yourself what you want. Which I understand may be the first time in this entire ordeal anyone has actually asked you. I did not have a ready answer for that, sitting there still faintly dusted in wool fibres, so I simply nodded and let the strange, unfamiliar relief of being asked, instead of instructed, settle over me for the first time in 3 exhausting weeks. I remained at Declan's palace considerably longer than either of us said aloud that it meant anything. Because there was, genuinely, nowhere safer for me to be while the shape of my situation sorted itself out, and because I found, somewhat to my own alarm, that I did not particularly want to leave. Declan's wolf did not improve its behaviour in the days that followed. It took to sitting directly outside my door most evenings, an arrangement the guards found endlessly amusing and Declan found endlessly mortifying, and once, during a formal council session I had no business attending, it simply walked in uninvited, crossed the entire chamber in front of 6 visiting dignitaries, and settled itself pointedly at my feet, refusing every command to return to its proper place beside the throne. The visiting dignitaries had reacted with a range of responses that afternoon, from poorly concealed amusement to open bewilderment, and one particularly stiff envoy from the southern holdings had asked, with careful diplomatic neutrality. Whether this was a customary feature of Declan's council proceedings. Declan had answered, with a straight face I genuinely admired, that neighbouring courts were welcome to adopt the practice themselves if they found it useful, which had done absolutely nothing to clarify the situation, and considerably more to make Ferris put his head in his hands. "I do not know how to apologise for that adequately," Declan said afterward, still faintly red about the ears. "I found it considerably more entertaining than most council sessions I have been forced to sit through," I said, which was true, and watched something in him ease at hearing it. The particular relief of a man who has spent his whole life being composed and has just discovered someone who does not require the performance of it. "May I ask you something?" he said, one evening, in the library that had quietly become the place we both gravitated toward once the day's formalities ended. "Why the wool? Of everything you might have hidden inside, why a barrel?" "Because it was the only cargo Corbyn had room for," I said, "and because I did not have the luxury of a more dignified escape plan. I would have hidden inside a cheese wheel if that had been what was available." Something flickered across his face, warm and startled, the closest thing to unguarded delight I had yet seen from him. I find I am unreasonably fond of that mental image. "I am glad my desperation amuses you," I said, though I was smiling despite myself, and understood, in that small, unremarkable moment, exactly how much easier this particular king made it to simply be myself, rather than perform gratitude or fear or anything else the situation seemed to demand. We talked longer that evening than either of us intended, about small things mostly. The particular chaos of a king who had never once expected his own wolf to embarrass him this thoroughly. The strange freedom of a woman who had spent 3 weeks being negotiated over finally being asked what she actually wanted. He told me, somewhat sheepishly, that he had ruled this court for 6 years without once feeling the particular unsettled pull his wolf had shown the moment it caught my scent among the wool, and that he had spent every hour since trying to decide whether that terrified him or simply made him curious. I told him, honestly, that I understood the feeling considerably better than I let on. If you want to find out whether Vasily accepted losing me quietly, and what Declan's wolf did the day it finally mattered most, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when the man an unwilling bride hides from decides he is not finished looking for her. It was Ferris who brought the news, 4 days later. That ended whatever quiet grace period I had been allowing myself to enjoy. Vasily, upon discovering my disappearance, had not simply absorbed the loss of a settled debt quietly. He had gone before his own council and several allied houses, publicly, claiming that his intended bride had been abducted from her father's lands by agents of King Declan, seeking to embarrass a rival kingdom and steal what was rightfully his under a signed debt agreement. "He is lying," I said, my voice going tight with the particular fury of watching your own choices rewritten into someone else's story. I ran. No one abducted me. I climbed into a wool barrel of my own free will because I would rather have frozen on a northern road than marry that man. "I do not doubt you," Ferris said, "but an accusation of abduction against a rival kingdom is not easily unmade by one woman's word alone, however true it is. Vasily has made himself the wronged party in every telling that matters politically, and he has done it deliberately to force your return through diplomatic pressure rather than admit publicly that a debt bride simply ran from him." I sat with that a long moment, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that hiding in a wool barrel had not actually ended my danger. It had simply changed its shape. Something in me that had spent 6 days quietly enjoying an unexpected reprieve stopped being quiet about it. I found Declan that same evening. "He has turned my escape into a weapon against your crown," I said. "I did not intend to hand you a diplomatic incident along with a woman hidden in your wool shipment. You did not hand me anything I did not choose to keep," Declan said, his jaw setting in a way I had not yet seen from him. "I am not returning you to a man who arranged to buy you like a debt settlement, regardless of what accusation he dresses that refusal in. We will simply need proof considerably harder to argue with than either of our word alone. And if we cannot find it in time, then I will stand in front of every Allied house myself and tell them plainly what I witnessed the day my own wolf pulled a frightened, wool-covered woman out of a delivery cart, he said. I do not intend to let a lie win simply because it arrived first. We spent the following days gathering exactly that, my father's own signed debt ledger, smuggled to us by a cousin still loyal to me, rather than to the arrangement, alongside sworn statements from 2 witnesses at my final meeting with Vasily, who had heard him speak of me in terms considerably closer to property than partnership. It was not, I understood, proof that would end the matter quietly. It was proof strong enough to survive Vasily calling it a lie in front of witnesses who could no longer credibly agree with him. My father's letter, when it finally reached me alongside the ledger, contained more apology than I had expected of him, though considerably less than the situation warranted. He wrote that he had believed the arrangement the only way to save our lands, that he had told himself I would come to accept it in time, and that watching the whole affair become a diplomatic incident across 2 kingdoms had finally shown him exactly how badly he had misjudged both the debt and his own daughter. I did not know, reading it, whether I forgave him yet. I only knew I no longer needed his forgiveness to decide what happened to me next. Ferris, meanwhile, had quietly begun tracking Vasily's movements through contacts along the border, and reported back, 2 days before the alley, that several of Vasily's most trusted men had left his hall without explanation, travelling in the general direction of Declan's own territory. Declan doubled the palace watch immediately, though neither of us fully anticipated how close to home the danger would actually come. Vasily, sensing the diplomatic pressure alone was not going to work quickly enough, moved to something considerably more direct. His men found me on an errand into the border town nearest Declan's palace. A simple trip for thread and paper I had insisted on making myself, rather than be treated as a prisoner in gilded halls, and it was in the alley behind the dressmaker's shop that they finally cornered me. I had grown, in those days, considerably more confident than I had any right to be, certain that Vasily's public accusation left him too exposed to risk anything so blatant. I understood, the moment a hand closed around my wrist from behind, exactly how wrong that confidence had been. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this. The twisted wrist, the waiting cart, my heel coming down on my captor's boot with everything I had left in me. Declan's wolf cleared the alley wall in a single motion that sent Vasily's men scattering. And Declan himself arrived a half-second behind it, hauling the man still gripping my arm away from me with a force that left no question about how close he had come to losing his composure entirely. "You dared send men into my own territory," Declan said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous, "to abduct the exact woman you have spent 2 weeks publicly claiming I abducted from you." I would very much like every witness in this alley to remember that detail clearly. Ferris arrived moments later with enough of the castle guard to make certain no second attempt followed the first. And it was in front of that same gathered crowd, alley merchants and border guards, and Vasily's own retreating men, that I finally said the thing I had been holding since the day I first climbed into that barrel. "I ran from you because you looked at me like a debt finally balancing," I said, loud enough to carry to every witness present. "You are standing here trying to drag me back by force after spending 2 weeks telling every allied house that I was stolen against my will. Which lie would you like the border town to believe, Lord Vasily, that I was taken, or that I simply could not stand another moment in your presence and would rather have frozen in a wool barrel than marry you?" He had no answer ready for that, in front of witnesses who would very much repeat every word of it by morning. I watched his composure crack for the first time since I had met him, the practiced diplomatic calm he had worn through 2 weeks of accusations finally failing him in front of the one audience he could not afford to lose, his own allied houses' trusted witnesses, watching a lord's carefully constructed story collapse under the weight of a woman's plain, unhurried testimony. Word of the alley confrontation reached the Allied houses within days, alongside the debt ledger and the sworn statements Declan's people had gathered, and Vasily's accusation collapsed as thoroughly and publicly as it had been made. He was forced to formally withdraw the abduction claim before his own council, his debt-bride arrangement voided entirely once the coercion behind it became impossible to deny, and he retreated to his own lands with considerably less standing among the Allied houses than he had held 2 weeks earlier. I did not attend the council session where his withdrawal was formally read aloud. Though Ferris described it to me afterward with considerable relish, a lord forced to admit, in front of the very houses he had spent 2 weeks courting sympathy from, that the woman he claimed had been stolen had in fact fled him of her own will, hidden in a wool barrel, rather than spend one more day under his roof. I did not need to witness it myself to feel the particular satisfaction of a lie finally collapsing under its own weight. Declan found me afterward in that same library, holding the bolt of undyed grey wool I had asked, somewhat sheepishly, to keep as a memento of the least dignified entrance anyone had ever made into his palace. I have spent 10 days trying to prove to you that being found in a wool barrel did not have to mean trading one man's plans for you for another's, he said. I do not think nearly losing you to an alley ambush was the demonstration I had intended. It worked anyway, I said. Though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it. He looked at the wool bolt still in my hands, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its bewildered, careful formality. I do not fully understand what my wolf recognized in a barrel of wool that afternoon. I only know I have not wanted to stop understanding it since. You already understood enough, I said. You listened. You believed me over a lord with considerably more standing than I had, and you never once asked me to be grateful for it. That is the only thing you ever needed to do. When he kissed me, careful and warm, a man who had spent 10 days genuinely bewildered by his own wolf and had finally stopped needing to explain it, I felt something in my chest. Some old, tired vigilance I had carried since the day my father first mentioned Vasily's name finally let itself rest. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had heard, by then, exactly how their king's wolf had found his queen buried in a wool shipment. Ferris stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in 10 days, entirely unworried. Corbyn was invited to the ceremony himself, at my insistence, and spent most of the evening being toasted by increasingly amused nobles, as the man who had unknowingly delivered a queen to her own court. A story he told with growing embellishment every single time he repeated it, until the barrel in his version had somehow become considerably smaller and the wolf considerably more terrifying than either had actually been. 6 months later, I stood in that same library with a letter from my mother in one hand and a formal gown trimmed, at my own insistence, with a narrow band of undyed grey wool woven through its hem in the other. My mother's letter asked, carefully, whether it was true her daughter, once so desperate she hid in a merchant's cart, was queen of Declan's realm now. I wrote back that it was true, and that the wool in question had been given rather better treatment than it received on that first uncomfortable journey. Ferris had stopped bracing every time Vasily's name came up in court proceedings, mostly, now that the man's standing sat considerably diminished among the Allied houses. The debt that had once been used to buy my hand had been quietly resettled through the Crown's own treasury, freeing my father from an arrangement he had, to his credit, come to regret deeply once he understood exactly what it had nearly cost me. And Declan's court, once so startled by a wolf's chaotic devotion to a wool barrel, had quietly gotten used to the idea that their king's composure would probably never fully recover, and had decided they did not particularly mind. My father visited twice in those 6 months, each time considerably more careful with me than he had ever been before, and though I had not fully forgiven him, I found the visits easier than I expected. Mostly because Declan never once pushed me toward reconciliation faster than I wanted to move. He simply made room for whatever pace I needed, the same way he had made room for me in that library on the very first evening, and I had come to understand that particular patience as the truest form of the devotion his wolf had announced so chaotically on the day we met. Declan's wolf, for its part, had never fully returned to its old dignified composure, and I had long since stopped expecting it to. It still greeted Corbyn's wool deliveries with an enthusiasm the rest of the household found endlessly entertaining, still refused, on principle, to let any council session run without at least once wandering over to settle at my feet. And I had come to understand that particular chaos not as an embarrassment to be managed, but as the truest, most honest thing about the man I had married, a king whose composure had never once survived being near me, and who had long since stopped wanting it to. I ran my fingers along the grey wool trim at my collar and thought about the woman who had curled herself into a barrel 3 mornings before her own wedding, certain of nothing except that she would rather freeze on an unfamiliar road than marry a man who looked at her like a ledger balancing. She had no idea, that desperate morning, that the wrong cart was about to become the exact right one. She only knew she could not climb into the right one, whichever one that was supposed to be. I like to think she would be glad now that she never asked Corbyn where that cart was actually headed. Do you think Declan's wolf would have found me in that wool shipment no matter which cart I had chosen, or was it simply my very poor luck and his very good fortune that I picked that particular one? Tell me your theory in the comments, and if you want to stay in this story a little longer, comment the wool barrel and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for climbing into that barrel with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Declan's Court. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills whose wolves know exactly what they are looking for long before the men attached to them catch up, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.